Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Senior B English, and we are now working with T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. Now, I have already given an introductory lecture to Four Quartets. I hope that that one you will be able to find on LearnStrong.net in the Senior B folder if you haven't seen it. Now we turn to the first of the four quartets, Burnt Norton, published in 1936. Eliot visited this area called Burnt Norton in 1934. Just to reiterate, the comments that I made earlier in my earlier introductory lecture, only a few of those am I going to revisit here. So it is really important that you give some time to studying that lecture before you come to this lecture, as well as my comments on T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and Holloman, for sure those two poems as we get into our conversation. Let's just remind our focus here as we work with Burnt Norton is learning theory, the ability to connect new information to old information, and we're constantly asking how we can do that in creative ways through our reading, which is why we have our three reading approach, our three-level reading approach. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, we're always asking about rhetoric. Here we'll look at things like symbolism and the repetition and a lot of the poetic techniques that make these lines such important and special lines. And then finally at level 3 we ask, how can I relate to this kind of information? First of all, at 3A, how can I relate to other texts that I already know? Now, once we get into the Four Quartets, especially after Burnt Norton, we'll begin to ask the question, how do the other three poems, these Coker, Dry Salvages, Little Gidding, relate back to Burnt Norton? In this lecture, we'll ask questions especially about Prufrock, Hollowman, Wasteland, those poems of T.S. Eliot that he wrote before, as we talked about in our earlier lecture. Now our approach, then finally, we'll ask at 3B, how can I relate to this information personally? I hope that by the end of our study together with Burnt Norton, that you are ready to pick up the poem and read it again and again and again on your own. And those of us who have spent any time with these poems will say that as we age, and this will sound something like what he says to Eliot, the poet, says in the poem, Burnt Norton, and elsewhere. As we age, we begin to see patterns that we didn't see before. And so I hope that this study will interest you in the life and work of T.S. Eliot in new ways. Now again, our approach is to work through each of the 5 sections. We're going to, first of all, have a reading of the section by the great actor Alec Guinness, who, like we used his voice in Wasteland, I just find he has a remarkable voice. By the way, T.S. Eliot has recorded readings of his own work as well. We just have found that we like this Alec Guinness reading so much that we're going to go ahead and use it. Then we're going to work through at level 1, our summary of each section, line by line. Then we're going to play the game of 2A messages, reminding you that we'll be playing that game of those messages as they relate to political, literary, and spiritual kinds of messages. See my intro lecture there, right? At the rhetoric side at 2B, we're going to be focusing on symbolism and on the echoes or the repetitions, especially there. And at 3A, we'll relate primarily to, in this lecture, Wasteland, Hollowman, Prufrock, Dante. We'll make some observations about Christian mystics and the like. And then finally, of course, we'll hope that we can begin to relate this information to ourselves. Now, let's do some quick background information. Get ready to do some quick notes. I hope that you've already Google imaged Burnt Norton so that you can at least see the place and the very garden that will be so important in the opening lines of this poem. We should point out that T.S. Eliot was writing Murder in Cathedral, which is such an important play for him in our study of T.S. Eliot, especially once he becomes that Christian in 1927, as we talked about in our other lecture. And these are, some of the lines from that very play are actually included in Burnt Norton itself, and many have seen those lines as the beginning of the poem Burnt Norton. The organization of this poem is very much like Wasteland from 1922 with the five different parts. One of the ways that I've said this before is, and I'm not alone in saying this, again, as I go back to that earlier lecture, everything that I have to say about this pretty much is built on the shoulders of great and influential scholars who I have read and sometimes even been taught by. Once you read Burnt Norton, you can read the other 3 of the 4 quartets so much easier. So paying attention in this lecture and working through, it's going to be methodical in our approach, will help you to be able to read the other 3, maybe, I would hope, on your own even before you engage in the reading with me. And as we've already said, I hope that you pick up Bert Norton and try and read it on your own and do your own annotative work, and then come to my study as a way to help. Okay. What's fascinating about Bert Norton is for a period of about 6 years, T.S. Eliot didn't write any poetry that he published. He was writing plays, he was writing essays, critiques, and that kind of thing. So this is a significant poem on that count as well. The actual Bert Norton is this manor, this big mansion near Aston-Sudgett in Gloucestershire in England. The original house was actually burned down by its inhabitant for reasons that we won't get into, and then rebuilt, and then that's why we have the term Bert, as in Bert Norton. T.S. Eliot visited with his pal, a woman named Emily Hale, in 1934. And the garden at the back of this rebuilt mansion or manor is really the central symbol of Bert Norton. You'll remember in our earlier lecture we said that these are poems about place, and Bert Norton, the place, but more particularly the garden behind, okay? And of course, let's go ahead and say it out loud, gardens are important in the history of literature. Go back to my Milton lectures, and of course, Paradise Lost, everything happens in the beginning of the poem, of course, in a garden, the Garden of Eden, right, from Genesis 3. We can also think about the importance of gardens in Hamlet, right? The father, of course, is killed. Hamlet's daddy is killed, of course, sleeping in a garden, right? Now, we've already said this, but we'll come back to it again. The Heraclitus quotes at the beginning, the 2 epigraphs, like Wasteland, like Hollow Men, like Proof Rock. T.S. Eliot liked these quotes at the beginning of his poem. It kind of set the tone. And again, the translation of the 2 Greek lines. The first one is, the wisdom, or logos, is common. The many live as if they have wisdom of their own. Okay? And then the second one, that will be very significant to the reading of Bert Norton, is the way upward and the way downward is one and the same. Now, many scholars have argued that while you can read Bert Norton and the rest of the 4 quartets, it's almost impossible to really summarize or paraphrase because so much is going on. We have 170 total lines, at least as I'm going to count them, sometimes referred to as 175 as different typesetters. We'll talk about this poem, but I'm going to go ahead and qualify it as 178 total lines. And I will say this out loud, although I'm going to reiterate this. Look, we're just scratching at the epidermal level, okay? Scholars will, of course, say about our treatment here that it is not in-depth enough. All I'm really interested in is helping you to be able to have a sense of how to read and, can I say this, experience these poetic lines. I think T.S. Eliot was very interested in you experiencing these lines, not just reading them. That's why it's so powerful to hear them read out loud. We're going to hear this amazing reading by Alec Guinness for that very reason. Again, the word sonata comes to mind, but T.S. Eliot liked the word quartet better. Musical words seem to kind of resonate with the reading of this poem. Now we're going to begin with section number 1, which is lines 1 through 48. So I hope you have a copy of Bert Norton in front of you, either digital or even better physically, so that you can annotate it as you go. We're going to listen to these lines of 1 through 48, and then we'll come back to do some exegesis. Okay? So here we go. Let's get ready. All right? The opening lines, Bert Norton.
Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. But to what purpose disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them, round the corner. Through the first gate, into our first world, shall we follow the deception of the thrush? Into our first world. There they were, dignified, invisible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves in the autumn heat, through the vibrant air, and the bird called in response to the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery, and the unseen eye-beam crossed, for the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. There they were as our guests, accepted and accepting. So we moved, and they, in a formal pattern, along the empty alley into the box circle, to look down into the drained pool. Dry, the pool, dry concrete, brown-edged. And the pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose quietly, quietly. The surface glittered out of heart of light, and they were behind us, reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed, and the pool was empty. Go, said the bird, for the leaves were full of children, hidden excitedly, containing laughter. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present.
All right, so there's your first introduction to the four quartets, and more particularly to Bert Norton. Right. I can see some of you already, the rolling of eyes, the you gotta be kidding me. What exactly is going on here? Let's say some things in preliminary. And then I'm going to follow the way most scholars follow a study of this, by taking line divisions and working through them. But let's go ahead and just say that at the very beginning, no pun intended, of the four quartets in Bert Norton opening lines, notice we've got some interesting resonances from other studies that we have done together over our time in 303. Notice, for example, we will begin with time in the beginning. Of course, we immediately think of Genesis 3. We think as well of in the beginning was the Word of John chapter 1, for those of us who study our biblical text. Of course, St. Augustine's Confessions, book 11, plays the same game of a simple question, so let's put it in our notes. What is time? The opening lines, then, of 1 through 5, time present and time past, are both perhaps present in time future. I love that he uses the word perhaps. I think sometimes readers of this poem have forgotten that in the second line of this poem, the word perhaps gets used. What we call the fallibilist position. Remember our epistemology and the understanding of epistemological positions. The absolutist position, I know, I'm right, you're wrong. That's absolutist. The extreme opposite of that is there is no absolute, there is no way to know. Of course, as we pointed out, the performative contradiction shows, yeah, it seems like when you tell me there are no absolutes that you're positing an absolute. Which begs the question epistemologically, what can we know? Where do we stand then in regards to the two polar extremes? The fallibilist position is that centered position. It is, of course, the position of originally science. It was the position that Socrates taught. The fallibilist position says, I think I'm right, I could be wrong. I'll wait for further data to validate or invalidate my position. The word perhaps, time present and time past, are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. Let's just put it in our notes as we've studied our Yeats. Yeats, of course, very much revered by T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, who talks a lot about that cyclical nature. Remember our comments from Second Coming, for example. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. Now that unredeemable word is a fascinating word. In other words, the idea here from the very beginning is the collapsing of past and future into a present. And because that's the case, you can never go back. As we have often said, in our time together in 303, there is no past. Put your hand on it. I talk to, for example, athletes who have had a bad experience, and all they want to talk about is that past bad experience, and I will say, show it to me. Give it to me. I want to touch it. I want to experience it. And they'll whip out a phone, for example. No, no, no. I mean, take me to that actual moment. Well, I can't go to that actual moment. You're right. It doesn't exist. Other than in our mind, it doesn't exist. Of course, the future, as we've pointed out many times, yeah, we never quite get there either, do we? So, for example, when we finally come to the moment of our death, we won't experience that moment of our death in the future. It will be a moment now, in the very present. To that degree, then, we as well maybe see the resurrection of some ideas of determinism, the idea of whether you have the capacity to change whatever it is that's happened in your life. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable, may for some of you be a hopeless kind of reading and taking you back to the wasteland study. Others will see this as the beginning already of a statement of reality. It is true, it is real, at least epistemologically in the fallibilist position we can speculate that it's true, that you can't go back and change stuff. In the future, well, we never actually quite get there, do we? We always think about the future, but we never actually experience the future because we're always in a perpetual present moment. Lines 6 through 10, what might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility. We're back to the word perhaps again. Only in a world of speculation, we can spend all of our time looking to the future and wondering what will happen next. Okay? Now, of course, in Europe, after the Great War, what we will call later the First World War, and that will be significant experience that Eliot and the rest of the world went through, right? It left a scar in a powerful way, so that everyone was always asking about the future. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? Of course, we still do that politically, don't we? What might have been and what has been point to one end, and then it's finally there, which is always present. So by the 10th line, we get our opening thesis. And it's actually not a very complicated thesis. There is no past. There is no future. There is only the present. And yet, talking about that's going to be very, very difficult. What kind of language can we use? Well, we'll continue. Footfalls, line 11 through 15 now, echo in the memory. Now this word echo is significant because we're going to hear it. Let's put it in our notes now. This notion of the echo, the repetition, the repeating over and over again will lead to T.S. Eliot's appreciation of patterns. Okay? And if you'll think about it, that's really what language is. Language is really just an echo that leads to patterns. Learning a new language, we start to learn this, don't we? It's one thing to know what a word in a foreign language means. It's another thing to be able to use that word in some kind of linguistic pattern. Yes? Of course, Wittgenstein, the great German philosopher, pointed out that the learning of those words is a way we play games with language. And Eliot was, of course, acutely aware of the ways in which language is got its problems. We'll get to it at the end of Bert Norton, right? Footfalls echo in the memory. Down the passage, which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. Now, this notion of the passage, another word for passage is obviously journey, immediately makes us think of everything from Homer's Odysseus to, of course, Dante's passage or journey, right? But notice in this suggestion, this is a passage that we didn't take. Towards the door we never opened. You can kind of imagine down a hallway, right? And you can see the door down there. We never quite got to it. Some have read this as the possibility of regrets, right? Notice as well that we've got the rose garden now mentioned for the first time. Now, of course, the rose garden is going to be juxtaposed to T.S. Eliot's 1922 desert of wasteland, where there is no rock, where there is no water, right? He says it finally at line 14, 15, my words echo thus in your mind. And it's almost as if, for the first time, and this to me sounds a whole lot like Whitman in Song of Myself, the way Whitman will speak directly to you, the reader. Here, the speaker-poet, T.S. Eliot, the speaker-poet, will say, I'm going to say some things, and it's going to echo in your mind. Now, the word mind is significant here, Because right away, he's playing a Platonic game, as we've played it many times in 303. We know that you have a body. We know that inside of that body you have a brain, right? Some of you will say, well, I thought I did before I started studying in 303. We know you have a brain. But where is your mind? If I cut open your brain, will I find your mind? Well, no. And of course, the throwaway line has always been that my mind is in my big toe. Well, you can put the mind anywhere. The question is, what is it? Notice here, we're dealing with Plato's two-box idea from earlier lectures. We've talked about this many times. In the first box, we have the physical, over-related to the five senses. What a little later we'll hear is maybe the first world of T.S. Eliot's Bert Norton. Then in the second box, we have those things that are not physical, but metaphysical, beyond the physical. You can have a physical, beautiful body. Beauty, however, is something you can't touch. Or as we will point out a little bit later in our poem, as we've said in 303 many times, there's a huge difference between the exchange of fluids, that we'll put in the first box as sex, versus what we'll call love in the second box, right? And on and on and on we can play that game. The word mind here is already beginning to set us up. He says, I'm going to say some things that will echo in your mind. In other words, I'm going to say some things that you're going to have to think about these things. In the end, words will not suffice, right? He says it, starting then at line 16. But to what purpose? Now, we're at this quest for meaning, right? Go back to my earlier lecture. I think this is central for T.S. Eliot. I think that after the First World War, the Great War, he and the rest of the world were looking for some kind of meaning. So he says it here. But to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves. I do not know. Now, this is fascinating. Why, in other words, am I even having this conversation with you, he asks. And he says it.